Alaska is known as the Great Northern Frontier, and today we're going to experience a little bit of what the gold rush
55
55 ounces.
in 1 week.
That's pretty exciting, guys.
In the summer of 1899, miners stormed the beaches of Nome, Alaska. They didn't need to dig. Gold was scattered right on the surface. Just scoop, pan, and strike it rich.
Suddenly, these people coming off a boat dragging sacks and bags and cases filled with gold.
But while Americans celebrated, Russian headlines took a darker tone. The land they sold for scraps was bleeding treasure, and the deeper the digging went, the clearer it became. Russia hadn't just made a mistake. They'd handed over an empire. Stick around. This story only gets wilder. U.S. miners stripped the surface of western Alaska, and what they found left Russia speechless. How Russia gave up Alaska. It all started with a single sea otter pelt, shiny, soft, and unlike anything the Russians had seen before. When Siberian hunters brought it back to St. Petersburg in the 1700s, it caused a stir. This wasn't just about fur. Russian officials saw a gold mine, an untapped land full of animals, ivory, and riches, just across the Bering Sea. That one pelt sparked a wave of excitement, and by 1741, their wild hopes were confirmed. Danish explorer Vitus Bering, sailing for the Russian crown, reached a rugged, untamed coastline that would later be known as Alaska, a place rich in life and apparently free for the taking. Within a few decades, the empire moved in fast. The Russian-American company threw up log forts from Kodiak all the way to Novo-Arkhangelsk, what we now call Sitka, and claimed a monopoly so absolute that even priests were forced to pay taxes in fur. But almost from the start, the dream began bleeding money. Local Aleut and Tlingit tribes, furious over forced labor and brutal treatment, pushed back hard. Stockades were burned. Supply ships had to crawl over 12,000 miles of ocean from Kronstadt just to keep the outposts going. And while Russia struggled to hang on, British and American traders slipped into the same bays and inlets, offering indigenous groups better deals and better weapons. By the 1850s, sea otter populations had collapsed from more than 300,000 to just a few scattered pockets. One historian later called Alaska Siberia's Siberia, isolated, expensive, and nearly impossible to control. Then came the Crimean War, and with it, disaster. The Russian defeat at Sevastopol didn't just shatter morale. It emptied the treasury and exposed how fragile the empire's farthest colonies really were. If Britain could bombard key fortresses in the Black Sea, what would stop its navy from sailing into Sitka and seizing Alaska too? For Tsar Alexander II, the warning was loud and clear. Holding on to Alaska would cost a fortune. Losing it for nothing would be humiliating. So the Foreign Ministry came up with a third option: sell it quietly, before anyone could take it. In 1861, Russian diplomat Eduard de Stuckel started reaching out behind the scenes. He tested the waters in Europe, but got nothing. Paris wasn't interested. Madrid walked away. Even Copenhagen said no. But over in Washington, someone was listening. U.S. Secretary of State William Henry Seward, still riding high after the Civil War, was eager to plant the American flag deep into the Pacific. He didn't see Alaska as frozen waste. He saw it as a potential naval outpost, a gateway to Asian trade, and a smart way to block Britain from creeping into the Pacific Northwest. By March 1867, talks hit full speed inside Seward's house in Lafayette Square. According to legend, the two men pored over maps laid out across a billiard table while whiskey flowed through the night. After a week of non-stop negotiating, they signed the deal at 4 in the morning on March 30th. The United States would pay $7.2 million, around $129 million today, for nearly 600,000 square miles of Alaskan land. That worked out to less than 2 cents an acre. The backlash was instant. Newspapers mocked the purchase as Seward's folly. One called it Wasted Walrussia. Another dubbed it the Polar Bear Garden. Most Americans couldn't even point to Alaska on a map, and certainly didn't see any value in its fog, glaciers, and frozen coastline. But in Russia, the sale was celebrated. The empire had pulled in much-needed funds, dropped a defense nightmare, and scored political points with a rising global power without firing a single shot. The official handover was full of ceremony but had very few people there. On October 18, 1867, now Alaska Day, 250 troops gathered on Castle Hill in Sitka. A 21-gun salute thundered across the harbor. The Russian flag was lowered, the stars and stripes raised. The only people there to witness it were a handful of Orthodox priests, some fur traders, and a few confused Tlingit observers. Still, the moment made headlines worldwide. One empire stepped out, another stepped in, and then silence. For almost 20 years, Alaska was left to drift. The U.S. military assigned a few officers to keep an eye on things, but there was no real budget, no blueprint, and no vision. No roads were built, no courtrooms opened. There wasn't even a proper system of local government. At one point, a single revenue cutter was expected to patrol a coastline longer than the entire eastern seaboard. Outside of Sitka, the U.S. did almost nothing, completely unaware that this empty land was sitting on top of resources that would one day be worth billions. Recent research in Russia has made the irony even more obvious. Scholars digging through old Russian-American company ledgers at the State Hermitage found that the final 3 years of colonial rule had drained more rubles in subsidies than the empire even received from the sale. Meanwhile, a 2024 study published in The Age of Reconstruction argues that Seward wasn't being reckless. He saw the acquisition as part of a bigger strategy. He believed America had to dominate the Pacific. Alaska was just one more step in that plan. But during those early years, the territory was basically lawless. U.S. officers complained that no law touches the land nor any arm can reach. Seattle merchants complained that customs duties weren't collected. Sailors joked that you could vanish north of the 64th parallel and answer to nobody but the bears. And yet, beneath all that stillness, something was quietly taking shape. Barely a year after the sale, the Times in London published a brief note hinting that Alaska might hold mountainous veins of wealth that could someday repay America 10 times over. It had no evidence, but it wasn't far off. Washington didn't take the bait. The Army slashed its budget. Congress focused on reconstruction and railroads. And Alaska waited. That long pause turned out to be a hidden advantage. It gave time for tensions with local indigenous groups to ease, for wildlife populations like reindeer to recover, and for bold adventurers to start drawing the first rough maps of river valleys and mountain passes. The names they jotted down, Fairbanks, Yukon, Klondike, would soon be etched into history. And for years after the transfer, Russia stayed confident it had made the right move. Internal documents praised the practical prudence of trading away an unmanageable outpost for guaranteed cash. But that certainty would start to unravel as the land began whispering its secrets. Alaska's gold craze. One glint of gold was all it took to flip Alaska from a forgotten outpost to a headline gold rush. In an instant, this cold northern frontier, mostly ignored since the U.S. bought it in 1867, was flooded with the kind of obsession only gold can bring. Word of a rich strike traveled faster than any steamer, triggering one of the wildest migrations the North American wilderness had ever seen. It began in the fall of 1880 when Tlingit guide Chief Cowee led two men, Richard Harris and Joe Juneau, up a narrow creek that fed into Gastineau Channel. Chief Cowee had already shown samples of gold ore to a Sitka-based engineer who promised a reward if he could pinpoint the source. And that's exactly what he did. Within days, they were pulling nuggets straight from the gravels of Gold Creek. By spring, a scrappy tent town called Harrisburg had popped up at the base of the mountain. Not long after, it was renamed Juneau, and it's still the capital of Alaska to this day. As the news spread, prospectors poured into the ravines of Douglas Island and the Silver Bow Basin. What started as small, scattered claims quickly grew into industrial-scale operations. The Treadwell mine emerged as one of the biggest, employing over 2,000 men and pumping out millions of dollars in bullion. And as with every boomtown, the gold brought more than miners. Merchants, gamblers, preachers, and drifters showed up in droves. By 1884, the chaos forced Congress to act, passing the first Organic Act to give Alaska a formal civil government and a federal judge who could try to keep the peace in a territory that was growing faster than the law could catch it. But gold fever never stays in one place for long. While Juneau was booming, new prospectors were already pushing deeper into the Alaskan interior. They followed the 40-mile river, staked claims along the Yukon, and built supply depots in places that had once been nothing but caribou tracks and spruce trees. Then, in the late summer of 1896, a discovery just across the border in Canada would set off a gold rush on a scale no one had seen before. A young Tagish man named Skookum Jim found coarse gold in a remote creek. Within weeks, that creek had a new name, Bonanza, and it lived up to the hype. By winter, news of the strike reached Seattle, and an estimated 100,000 men and women began the brutal journey north in hopes of striking it rich in the Klondike. The fastest path to the Klondike ran through Alaska, and frontier towns like Skagway and Daya exploded overnight. Plank sidewalks were slapped together, scam artists sold fake maps and overpriced supplies. The infamous Chilkoot Trail, 33 miles of ice, snow, and sheer misery, became a human conveyor belt. Stampeders had to haul a literal ton of gear to satisfy Canadian entry laws, making multiple trips up a slope so steep it looked like a frozen ladder. If they survived avalanches, frostbite, and the occasional theft, they reached Lake Bennett, built makeshift boats, and rode the Yukon River Rapids toward Dawson City. But not all of them made it to Canada. Some stayed behind, quietly picking through promising gravels on the American side. That same year, farther west, Alaska struck gold again. And this time, it wasn't just good, it was outrageous. In September of 1898, 3 Scandinavians, Norwegian-American Jafet Lindeberg and Swedish partners Eric Lindblom and John Bryntesen, found coarse gold in Anvil Creek, a desolate patch of land just above a coastal spit called Nome. Then, in the spring of 1899, something even more unbelievable surfaced. The beach sand itself was loaded with fine gold, so much so that it could be scooped up by hand. Nome exploded. Within months, 10,000 people swarmed the shoreline: miners, gamblers, dance hall performers, thieves, and drifters. Tents, driftwood shacks, and saloons stretched along the surf line. Claims overlapped, arguments turned violent, and the U.S. Army had to send in cavalry units just to maintain order. Meanwhile, the United States Geological Survey arrived and confirmed what the miners already knew. Some stretches of beach sand contained as much as $20 worth of gold per ton. And this was gold you didn't have to dig for. It was lying right there in the surf. Nome didn't just boom, it outshined Juneau. It became the largest city in the territory almost overnight. Steamer logs listed whiskey, mining gear, and printing presses all shipped in together. Telegraph wires buzzed with sandbar gold prices headed for San Francisco. But while some got rich, most did not. Many froze, failed, or got conned out of their claims. The real money, as usual, went to the outfitters, freight lines, and clever business owners selling overpriced coffee and pancakes. The news reached across the ocean. Russian state-controlled newspapers ran cartoons mocking the Tsar's decision to sell Alaska, now realizing it sat on beaches full of gold. Memos from St. Petersburg's Ministry of Finance privately called it an unfortunate undervaluation of the land they had practically given away. Even after the fever cooled, gold kept flowing. Juneau's hard rock tunnels stayed active until the Second World War. And though Nome's glory days are long gone, Locals still pan for placer flakes every summer, some using suction dredges to chase what's left in the sand. But Alaska wasn't done surprising the world. Up the Kuskokwim River, engineers are now preparing to tap the Donlin prospect, one of the biggest undeveloped gold deposits on Earth. If regulators approve it, Donlin could produce over 1 million ounces a year for nearly 30 years. Just weeks ago, investors poured fresh capital into the project, betting that what the beach panners started more than a century ago is still worth finishing. And yet, even as gold built Alaska's first fortunes, something else caught the attention of prospectors. Blue-green streaks glinting in mountain cliffs, coal seams jutting from hillsides. The gold rush may have started it all, but what came next would power cities, build industries, and shift the balance of power in ways no one back then could have imagined. Beyond gold, Alaska's industrial bounty. Gold may have brought the first rush, but it didn't take long for Alaska to show it had far more to give. Just beneath the ice and rock was a different kind of wealth, one that could light up cities, move armies, and reshape entire economies. Above the Kennecott Glacier and the Wrangell Mountains, a greenish streak on a cliff face caught prospectors' eyes at the dawn of the 20th century. What they found wasn't just copper. It was ore running more than 70% metal, a grade so high it stunned geologists across the lower 48. That single discovery set off a chain reaction. Within months, J.P. Morgan and the Guggenheim family launched the Kennecott Copper Corporation, and surveyors cut through ice and muskeg to chart a 200-point path. By 1911, a full mine and mill were running at full tilt. Over the next 27 years, those tunnels produced over 4.6 million tons of ore, valued at more than $200 million at the time, worth billions today. To move it all, they built the Copper River and Northwestern Railway. It stretched across valleys torn by frost and rivers locked in ice, supported by 190 trestles. That railway didn't just haul copper, it proved that Alaska's terrain, no matter how brutal, could be engineered into submission. The copper boom shifted attention to another resource: coal. In the years between 1910 and 1919, geologists mapped massive coal seams buried beneath the Matanuska Valley and along the remote Bering River coastline. These black rock layers could have fueled the entire Pacific Fleet. The U.S. Navy even considered opening federal mines. However, land disputes and political delays kept production limited. Still, over 7.5 million tons were mined before the mid-20th century. Then came oil. In the late 1950s, seismic crews on the Arctic slope began picking up unusual echoes, signs that hydrocarbons might be hiding deep beneath the permafrost. And then, on March 12, 1968, the Prudhoe Bay State No. 1 well delivered the answer. It struck what would become the largest conventional oil field ever discovered in North America. Engineers estimated that 25 billion barrels were sitting underground, with more than half recoverable using the technology of the time. Getting that oil to market took another feat of brute force engineering. Surveyors cut a corridor down the state's spine, and welders laid an 800-mile pipeline, 48 inches wide, from the Arctic Ocean to the port of Valdez. They built across 3 mountain ranges and designed special supports to keep the pipe elevated above thaw-sensitive ground. On June 20, 1977, oil began to flow. At its peak, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System moved over 2 million barrels per day. Since then, it has delivered more than 17 billion barrels of crude. Those barrels helped build the Alaska Permanent Fund, which now sends annual dividend checks to every single resident. But even that wasn't the end. In March 2023, federal regulators approved ConocoPhillips's Willow project in the National Petroleum Reserve. Crews are now preparing 3 drilling pads, aiming to produce up to 180,000 barrels per day at peak. That's nearly 1/3 of the state's current output. Legal challenges are ongoing, but construction has already begun. Supporters call it a crucial project for future stability. Critics warn of damage to permafrost and local ecosystems. Either way, it's happening. Oil wasn't Alaska's only giant. In the 1980s, a new metal began making headlines: zinc. North of the Arctic Circle near Kotzebue, the Red Dog Mine was carved into NANA Corporation land. Since its opening in 1989, it has grown into one of the largest zinc operations in the world. Its concentrate feeds smelters from Asia to Europe and has funded schools, clinics, and infrastructure across the Northwest Arctic Borough. For the Inupiat communities that live nearby, Red Dog is more than a mine. It's an economic engine. As the world moves toward electrification, the spotlight has shifted again. Battery metals, rare earths, and graphite are now in high demand, and Alaska is answering. On the Seward Peninsula, Graphite One is developing Graphite Creek, a site that just received Defense Production Act Title III funding. It's expected to produce 175,000 tons of concentrate annually, with a projected mine life of at least 20 years. That's 3 times the original estimate. Farther south, Eucor Rare Metals is advancing the Bocan Mountain project on Prince of Wales Island. The goal is to supply heavy rare earths like dysprosium and terbium, elements vital to wind turbines, electric vehicles, and military technology. These are materials that China dominates globally. Bocan is part of a growing push to build secure domestic supply chains. But unlocking new minerals means building new roads, and that's proving harder than digging a hole. The Ambler Access Project was designed to stretch 211 miles west of the Dalton Highway, opening up rich copper, cobalt, and zinc deposits in the Brooks Range. It won approval in 2020, but permits were suspended in 2023 and formally denied in 2024. Supporters argue the road is vital to national supply chains. Opponents say it cuts across caribou habitat and threatens indigenous subsistence grounds. For now, the project is frozen in red tape. Then there's Pebble Mine, perhaps the most controversial resource project in Alaska's history. Sitting upstream from Bristol Bay, the site holds billions in copper, gold, and molybdenum. But it also looms over the world's most productive sockeye salmon fishery. In January 2023, the Environmental Protection Agency issued a rare Clean Water Act veto, citing unacceptable risks to salmon runs and indigenous livelihoods. Alaska challenged the decision, even petitioning the U.S. Supreme Court. But in early 2024, the court declined to hear the case, effectively halting the project. For now, Pebble's massive mineral reserves remain untouched. Step back and a clear pattern comes into view. Alaska isn't about one strike or one era. It's a constantly evolving map of buried power. From copper under glaciers to zinc in tundra, from coal seams to battery metals, the ground keeps giving. A 2024 U.S. Geological Survey report now lists Alaska as home to at least 27 of the 34 critical minerals essential to national security. Analysts estimate the state's total in-ground value at over $1 trillion. That's what $7.2 million bought in 1867. Today, engineers talk about carbon capture hubs on the North Slope, hydrogen from stranded natural gas, and even small nuclear reactors to power remote mines without diesel. But through every twist, one truth holds steady. Alaska still holds what the modern world runs on. From boomtowns to battlegrounds, Alaska's next chapter began just a few miles from Siberia. The Northern Shield, Alaska goes to war. After decades of drilling, mining, and pipelining, Alaska faced a new challenge. The Northern Outpost woke to war in June 1942 when Japanese bombers struck Dutch Harbor and troops seized Attu and Kiska, the first foreign occupation of U.S. soil since the War of 1812. That attack shattered any illusions. These windswept islands weren't backwoods. They were America's fragile Northern Shield. Washington responded fast. Within weeks, more than 140,000 soldiers and engineers surged into the territory. They blasted runways from volcanic rock, dropped prefab huts into sleet, and carved a road across Canada. The Alaska Highway, started in April 1942 and drivable by December, finally tied the territory to the lower 48 by land. In May 1943, soldiers fought through blizzards by hand on Attu and retook it, while fog let Japanese forces quietly abandon Kiska. That grim campaign made one thing clear. Alaska's geography mattered more than its gold. The airfields at Elmendorf and Eielson, forged in the Aleutian fires, now gave bombers one-hop access to Asia. When the Cold War began, those airfields hummed non-stop. The Beaufort Sea's narrow stretch, barely 55 miles wide, was intensely monitored. In the mid-1950s, radar designers planted the distant early warning line, dome-topped stations that stretched from the Aleutians to Greenland, peaking above tundra like giant golf balls. Elmendorf became a nerve center, lighting up with alerts as Soviet Bear bombers probed U.S. airspace, and crews scrambled fighters that could fly over the pole in minutes. By the 1960s, Alaska bristled with missile batteries, tanker squadrons, and nuclear-armed interceptors. Soviet war games flagged Anchorage and Fairbanks as top targets. Kremlin planners also quietly watched Alaska's output, Prudhoe Bay oil and Kennecott copper now fueling American industry. That $7.2 million purchase had turned into the front porch of a superpower standoff. After the Soviet collapse, the radar chain fell into disrepair, but new threats revived it fast. By 2024, satellite imagery revealed upgraded runways and Russian S-400 missile batteries at Pevek on the Chukchi Sea, directly across that same 55-mile strait. Washington responded in kind. The 2024 Department of Defense Arctic Strategy designates the Bering Strait as a strategic choke point, backing over-the-horizon radar, ice-capable ports, and 2 new polar-class icebreakers. Congress also funded modern radar upgrades and extensions to the North Warning System across northern Alaska. Training intensified too. In July 2024, more than 500 pilots and crew from 6 NATO nations gathered at Elmendorf and Eielson for the Arctic Defender exercise. They flew Eurofighters and F-35s under full Arctic daylight, rehearsing how an Article 5 scenario would play out in the high north. That exercise drove home the point. Alaska is not just America's shield, it's the alliance's shield. Meanwhile, China, which officially calls itself a near-Arctic state, issued a white paper in 2018 outlining polar shipping lanes and research bases, an effort it has expanded since. Retreating sea ice now invites cargo vessels along the northern sea route and telecom companies to test satellites over the pole. These maritime and digital corridors all edge closer to Alaska's shores, sharpening the Defense Department's focus on maritime domain awareness. You can see the buildup in infrastructure. Old radar sites near Nome and Galena are being replaced with modern solid-state arrays. Runways at Eielson are extending for KC-46 Pegasus tankers. And offshore, Coast Guard polar security cutters will soon patrol year-round, vital as cruise ships, LNG tankers, and research vessels push north with the retreating ice. Climate change adds urgency. Thinner pack ice means less warning time for intercontinental missile launches over the pole, and the Arctic Ocean floor opens paths for undersea cables and potentially hostile submarines closer to Anchorage and Prince William Sound. For planners, Alaska is now a chessboard where resource security, climate change, and great power rivalry collide. For Alaska's indigenous communities, the changes are personal. In Utqiagvik, sirens now sound monthly for tsunami and missile drills. In Nome, drone and reconnaissance flights share space with supply planes. Alaska has transformed into both a storehouse and a fortress, a shift that's changing school lessons, city budgets, and even hunting regulations. The scale is real. Over 15,000 active duty troops and 20,000 guardsmen are now stationed. There, more than during the peak of the gold rush. Joint military exercises inject hundreds of millions into local economies. Radar upgrades promise decades of jobs, keeping workers busy from the Aleutians to the Beaufort Sea. Still, the margin is slim. Aleutian storms still pummel radar installations. Thawing permafrost warps runways faster than engineers can reinforce them. Every new runway or radar dome upgrade feels like a race against both powerful rivals and a warming climate. It all started with bombs over Dutch Harbor. 80 years later, Alberta's mines revealed Alaska's wealth, but its skies and seas have shown its vital place in global defense. As rival flags circle the Arctic, the Northern Shield must stand firm, because the next threat could come not from storms, but missiles, drones, or undersea cables, faster than any blizzard. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.